I do have a confession. I cheated last week. When you ask the administrator of a Christian school to talk about Christian, it's going to come really easy. So it just kind of felt like cheating. It was a little bit of a rude awakening to come up with a message that wasn't about Christian education for this week. I'm a little bit rusty. I will say that probably last week's the easiest, I think, a message I've ever come, which makes sense. I think that you assume that it would come easy to the administrator. But before we kick it off, we're going to talk about Abraham. But before we do, I want to start with a question. Have you ever felt disqualified or maybe at some point there was a promotion that came along the line and you were promoted into a position that you weren't sure you had the right to, weren't sure you were actually for. It's not a good feeling. I think sometimes that can happen in our Christian walk when we start asking the questions of God. Can you really use me despite all of my past failures, despite my past in general, despite my lack or perceived lack of gifts and talents? Is there really anything that God can use me for in greatness? Because we look through the Bible and we look at these amazing stories of miraculous achievements of the men and women of God. You read Hebrews 11. It's that passage about the great heroes of our faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac. By faith, Moses. By faith, the people of Israel crossed into the Red Sea. 32 says, what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. Like, if that passage doesn't make you feel a little bit unequipped, I don't know what does. By show of hands, who has ever shut the mouth of a lion? Anyone? Okay. We'll go an easier one. Who has ever sent foreign armies to flight? Anyone? No, that's crazy. I look at this passage, I'm like, I can't do any of that. I would never be equipped to handle any of those things that you're saying I should be able to if I am an equipped follower of Jesus and man of God. We get caught up sometimes. I think that we forget that these great victories were attached to men and women of God that were deeply flawed. And we think of these mountaintop moments and we look at these final exams, right? Where they actually, most cases, they finally got it right. Most of the people that were just named as these great acts of faith, that was like their big moment. A lot of times, they were deeply flawed. They had a lot more mistakes than they had victories, and God had to pick them up a lot more times as we read through. And so I think it's important that as we think about these great men and women of God that were deeply flawed, that we remember that these are the greatest mountaintop experiences. These men and women of God had valleys, and they had trials, and they were tested as well. So we're going to go back to Genesis. We're going to start at the end, and then we're going to go back to the beginning. Because we want to talk about Abraham the man. We don't want to talk about Abraham, that one mountaintop experience. It's like walking onto the campus of a law school and walking into wherever they take the bar exam, and you start reading over the student's shoulder. You start reading the questions on the bar exam, and you're like, these questions, how could anybody answer these questions? You can't throw out the fact that they just spent 7 years in law school being tested and tried and learning the answers to these questions. By the time Abraham gets to this moment, it's been 30 to 35 years of epic failures. And he finally gets it right. And we want to talk about those failures and what they mean and how they can relate to us this morning. Genesis 22, 1 through 3. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham. And he said, here am I. He said, take your son, your only son. If that's not foreshadowing to the cross, I don't know what is. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the firewood for the burnt offering, and rose and went to the place of which God had told him. is testing Abraham. Is the father of his new nation, does he fear God? Can he be trusted with what God has promised to him? The ultimate question, will Abraham honor the gift more than the giver? Ultimate test. God has given him Isaac, the great promise of his life, the heir to a new nation that he's been promised. And God says, I need to know once and for all, are you going to honor me, the giver, more than you honor the gift? And he asks him to lay him down. I have a son. My oldest son is named Isaac. Nope, I could not do this. I can stand before you right now and tell you that if God required me of this, I would fail. I would fail. And you look at these moments and just remember that we have to consider the education. The 35 years that God has brought Abraham through to this point, to that ultimate test, and said, will you honor me more? Honor me more than the gift that I promised you, more than the gift that I have given you. It's important to remember that these ultimate displays of faith of these great men and women of God that we put so much emphasis on and so many lessons on and so many VBS themes, right? They are redemption stories. And this is no different. From Genesis to Revelation is God's great story of redeeming mankind. And tucked in Genesis is the redemption of Abraham. A deeply flawed man of God. So we're going to look at Abraham the man. And to do so, we're going to go back to Genesis 12. And what I love about this is when we're first introduced to Abraham, his name isn't even Abraham, it's Abram. And we're introduced to his wife, Sarah. Her name's not even Sarah, it's Sarai. A couple other times in the Bible, but we're going to see a name shift later. So it's important to know that Abram means exalted father. So Abram translated into exalted father, and Sarai translated into little princess or my princess. And it's thought of as kind of like a term of endearment of a father, like my little princess would be the translation. So we've got an exalted father, and you've got my little princess, and we get to know Abram quite a bit. Sarai we don't get to know very much about. Two main themes that you're going to see throughout all of Genesis is she's beautiful. Turned the heads of the king at 90 years of age beautiful. I don't even know what that means. But she was very, very beautiful, and she was very, very barren. Really, two of the biggest and some of the only things that we learn about Sarai or Sarah is that she's beautiful and that she is barren. Now, something to be aware of, and we're going to touch on it a little bit later, there was great shame in being barren, especially if you were one of the great houses. We'll get an idea of some of Abraham's holdings later in the story, but this was not Abram and Sarai and their nephew and a couple donkeys. They had huge livestock holdings. They were a very wealthy family. They would have been known without the region. They would have had many servants. They would have had many caretakers of the livestock. And so her shame would have been before many. Right? This isn't the candlestick maker's wife that nobody really knows, and they don't have any kids, but nobody knows why, but nobody talks about it. Right? I mean, she's supposed to produce an heir for a great house in a time when that was one of her major honors and duties, was to provide an heir, and she can do it. So she's beautiful, and she's carrying this weight of shame of being. 12:1-3. It says, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. So he's saying, Abram, I want you to pack everything up that you own. I want you to move your entire life and livelihood to what we would very shortly find out was Canaan. Now, Canaan, it was about a 400-mile journey. This is no small trek. He's not hopping over the river and through the woods. 400 miles. To put it in perspective, Washington, D.C. is 390 miles from here. So roughly a distance from here to Washington, D.C., he has to take everything with him. It is a land, it is a time and an era when being a bandit or a thief on the road was a full-time occupation. It was a very dangerous time to travel. And they didn't have debit cards, have U-Haul trucks, right? So they would have been very exposed for a prolonged amount of time with everything they owned. Every amount of wealth that they had, every gold coin, everything precious to them would have been on their person. This was a very expensive, a very long, and a very dangerous journey. But immediately we see Abram, respond in faith. And he does just what God says. He leaves his father's house, he packs up everything that he owns, all of his livestock, and he starts making this 400-mile trek to the land of Canaan. Cool. It's hard in some of the time frames in here. What seems like happened very quickly could have been years, we don't know. It gives us glimpses of Abram's age between now and when Isaac is actually born. We know at this point in time he's 75. But between verses 9 and 10, we really don't know how long it's been, but it seems like it hasn't been real long. And all of a sudden, so quickly in the story, we see Abram's faith crack. It says, now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe. God said, go to Canaan, and I will provide for you. Abram says, I'm really hungry. I don't think you are, Egypt. Right? I mean, that's what God didn't call him out of Egypt, or God didn't call him released from Canaan. God said, go here, I will provide for you. I will be your provision and your protection and your promise. I'm hungry, I'm going to go to Egypt. And then immediately following that, they're getting ready to cross Egypt. And it says, he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, know that you are a woman, beautiful in appearance. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is my wife, or this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with you because of you, and that my life might be spared for your sake. So he says, Sarai, you gotta lie. It's actually a half lie. We find out later in his conversation with Abimelech that it's actually his half-sister. They had the same father, different mothers. So they use this half-truth to tell a lie. And Abram watches as his wife, the wife of promise, the wife that was to be the line of a great nation, left to be the harem in another man's kingdom. Because he was scared. Because he said, if you're my wife, they'll kill me. If you're my sister, they'll just take you. How did that make you feel, ladies? Anyone sign up for that show? So immediately, having gotten to Canaan, this great display of faith, 400 miles, we see not only is he lacking faith in God's provision by going to Egypt because there was a famine, but he's immediately lacking faith in God's protection. He didn't cross into Egypt and say, listen, you're my wife, we're promise. God has said that we're gonna parent a nation, and so obviously nothing can happen to you, and so God's got our back. So his faith cracking. Awesome promise. Chapter 13, just a passing glance at that. Abram and Lot separate. Verses 10 and 11, we see Lot is a young man. They come to the point where they no longer coexist in the same land. They've got too many cattle. They've got too many men. The overseers of the flocks are bickering because there's not enough grass for both of them. And Abram said, listen, we're kinsmen. Let's not be bickering and fighting about this. You pick one direction. I'll pick the other direction. It says that Lot his eyes, looked at the river Jordan, which was obviously the closer land, the more fertile land. It was the choice, it was kind of the choice A, and he took it. Which in culture, the respect should have gone to the elder. Even if he was given the option, Lot should have declined the better land and given it to Abram. So we see a little glimpse at Lot's heart right there. In chapter 14, Abram rescues Lot, and he gets caught up in this war that's happening by these cities, and he gets taken captive. And I want to draw attention to something in verse 14 because it begins to put into perspective just how big Abram's court is. So in chapter 14, verse 14. It says, when Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them. So we'll take a minute to go back to Sarai's shame, okay? So this is not 318 men total in the camp. This is just a 318 trained personal guard of Abram. Okay, this isn't the farmers, this isn't the vineyard keepers, this isn't the cook and the packer. There was a whole infrastructure around them of servants. This is his personal guard. I don't know what that translates as far as like a total number, but it had to be a couple thousand. If just the personal guard was 318 people, you're talking thousands of people that would have known that Sarai was barren. Thousands of people known that she couldn't fulfill that one most important duty to provide an heir for Abram. Her shame would have been in front of a multitude. In 15, 1 through 6, we see God renewing his promise. And it's interesting, as every time he renews it, he gets a little bit more specific and a little bit more specific. Chapter 15, 1 through 6. After these things, so he rescues Lot. He brings him back. Melchizedek makes an offering for him. They share a meal together. And it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, your reward shall be great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue child of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. Said, this man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside, and he said, look towards heaven and number the stars. If you are able to number them, then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. God is getting more and more specific in his promises, despite the fact that Abram continues to lack faith in God's provision, continues to lack faith in God's protection. God is honoring his covenant. When God makes a promise to us, it doesn't matter how badly we try to mess it up. He's going to follow through, and he's going to do exactly what he said that he's going to do. And so he renews the vow, and he reminds him that he's going to have an heir of his own, that he's going to be the